I love this series. 5 bags of popcorn. When you got movie review shows like Tim Heidecker in them, you can't lose. Hi, I'm Blinky, and you're watching my analysis of On Cinema, also known as On Cinema at the Cinema, also known as On Cinema and More in the Morning, Our Cinema, On Cinema on Demand, or as I like to call it, Tim Heidecker and Gregg Turkington's greatest creation. It's not often I see a series so incredible that I feel the need to immediately binge it from beginning to end, but that is the case for On Cinema. Over the past year and a half or so, I went from having barely any knowledge of the series to becoming an enormous fan that would put it amongst the best comedy series in existence. I've opened up a lot of my Adult Swim reviews by saying that my favorite show produced by the company was a toss-up between Home Movies and Moral Laurel. Even though it's a web series, and not all of it is produced by Adult Swim, I have a third show to add to that three-way tie. On Cinema is a series that I have been passively aware of for a long time. I saw a few episodes and I figured I got the joke of it being about two pseudo-movie critics who ramble about nothing, instead of offering any sort of insight into what they're talking about. I was also aware of the show Decker, and heard about a 5-hour satirical murder trial starring Tim Heidecker, but I had no idea they were related to this main series in any way. I saw an episode of On Cinema here and there, and thought it was amusing enough, but never gave it my full attention. That wasn't until I started work on my video talking about Tom Goes to the Mayor, and looked more into this franchise, which I realized had been running for over a decade. The reason I became so interested in On Cinema is because I started to see analysis videos from other YouTubers. In particular, I recommend Admiral Gorg's many videos about On Cinema as a great starting point to get you interested. Thanks to him, I'm happy, I'm healthy, and I'm high. Much like Kenny vs. Spenny, it is extremely hard for me to bring anything new to the table when other channels have covered On Cinema so thoroughly and efficiently. In other words, when it comes to what I want to say about it, I'm like an empty bottle drained of everything left in my mind. Nevertheless, since this series really is that incredible and underappreciated, I still feel the need to talk about it in some capacity. If I've convinced even one person to check out On Cinema through this video, then that'll be enough to fill me up again. This intro isn't going to make any sense to anyone unfamiliar with the show. I'm going to talk about On Cinema without going into much spoiler territory, which is easier said than done, given that a huge part of what makes the series so good is its ability to branch off into the many storylines that run throughout its universe. As such, I'm going to give a basic overview of the development of the series, and go into some character arcs, while not going into too much detail about where those arcs end. Also, for the sake of clarity, when I talk about the fictionalized versions of our two leads that exist within the On Cinema universe, I'm going to call them Tim and Gregg. When I talk about the real people who play these characters, I'll refer to them as Heidecker and Turkington. Let's get into it. On Cinema had humble beginnings as an independently produced podcast created by Heidecker and Turkington during their downtime while filming the movie The Comedy. Essentially, the idea for the podcast is that it starred fictionalized versions of its two leads, who reviewed movies while offering extremely surface-level knowledge for the topics that they were talking about. This is especially apparent in the first few episodes of the podcast, which typically ran for only a few minutes at most, with the first episode being as short as 1 minute and 45 seconds. Tim and Gregg start the podcast, give some very basic insight about the movie in question, both say that they liked it, and then sign off. This is an obvious jab at internet critics who have nothing important or substantial to say about a topic, yet they act if there's some kind of authority for no other reason than, well, they have a podcast. The fact that this series started back in 2011 doesn't date it in any way, because this type of shallow internet content is still prevalent to this day. It's kind of crazy because I wouldn't think Heidecker and Turkington would be ones to watch much creator-based internet content, and maybe they don't, but based on how accurate their satire is, they at least have their finger on the pulse of the prevalent issues found in these type of online communities. The On Cinema podcast lasted nearly 50 episodes, until Tim and Gregg announced a change in format with their new show On Cinema at the Cinema. While following a similar formula as the podcast, On Cinema at the Cinema would be filmed rather than audio only, and would feature the two reviewing new movies in theaters rather than classics. They would also delve into reviewing older movies too, via Gregg's Popcorn Classics segment, as well as introduce other segments such as On Cinema on Location. If you've kept up with my channel, you'll know that the two most popular types of content I tend to produce are videos about Adult Swim, and videos about satirical internet review shows and the personalities behind them. I really can't think of a show that could be possibly more tailor-made for me specifically than On Cinema. One thing I've come to notice about a lot of satirical internet reviewers is that the content these producers create is infinitely more interesting when you delve into the psychology of the people behind the characters that they portray. On Cinema knows this all too well, and the series essentially turns into a character study of Tim and Gregg. For a while, On Cinema at the Cinema followed the same formula as the podcast, with the main joke being Tim and Gregg talking about movies, with Tim occasionally getting off topic and bringing up politics much to Gregg's dismay. The second season of On Cinema at the Cinema introduces the first running story arc, with Tim getting a blood clot in his brain and refusing to get surgery, which causes problems for him both physically and in his marriage. At this point, the focus was still on the movies, with the blood clot being a minor footnote. That sounds strange saying it out loud. But as the seasons continue, these running storylines become much more prominent, with the movie reviews becoming much less prominent. On Cinema isn't the only web series I've seen where it starts off as a typical review series, before delving into something deeper and more character-focused. The first series that came to my mind was Cinemassacre's Board Games, which starts off as a goofy board game review show, before delving into a surreal horror comedy by its third season. The other web show that On Cinema really reminded me of was Hot Diggity Demon's Brain Dump, which initially served as a way for Max Gilardi to express his real genuine opinions on media, and eventually becomes more of a self-reflective deep dive on the fictionalized version of Max that acts as a voice for many of his own insecurities. As much as I love both of those series, On Cinema manages to be funnier, deeper, and expands its universe far beyond anything I've ever seen before. Doing something like this is a risky move creatively, as I often see a lot of people complain about how the more elaborate storylines in review shows take away from the analysis of the media in question. In the case of On Cinema, the characters were never offering any sort of real insight toward the movies in question in the first place, so this type of a shift feels a lot more welcome. If On Cinema had stuck with its original formula of two bumbling film critics rambling about nothing, there's no way the show would have lasted as long as it has. The way this show became so character-focused really managed to turn it into something both unique and fantastic. Let's talk about how the review show itself affects said characters. While both Tim and Gregg have high opinions of themselves, due to their supposedly refined taste in movies, the way this strokes their individual egos is quite different. Tim is under the impression that if people tune into the show to hear about his opinion on film, the audience also must want to hear about his opinions on everything else under the sun. As such, Tim uses his platform to talk about politics, alternative medicine, business investments, and promote his other projects such as his band and TV show. Watching Tim's character honestly reminds me of real-life fallen arcs of internet critics I used to watch, which leaves me with a strange, meta, and existential feeling. I won't name names, but let's just say that Tim's character absolutely seems like the type of person who would scam his fans out of money for a movie that he never made, or fail to fulfill his promises on his Patreon. In terms of Gregg's character, he has the opposite problem in terms of how he lets his ego get out of control. While Tim greatly diverges from the topic of movies in favor of talking about motorcycles or whatever random interest he has gotten into that week, Gregg never strays from the subject of film and frequently gets angry at Tim for getting off topic. It might sound like that's reasonable on a movie review show, and to an extent it is, but the longer you watch On Cinema, the more you realize that movies are the only important thing in Gregg's life. He has no other interests whatsoever, and will often bash other forms of entertainment, such as music or television, for not being as important as cinema. If it wasn't for his self-proclaimed title as a film expert and massive VHS collection, Gregg would have nothing to aspire toward in his life. This is another case where I can think of so many online content creators whose entire video catalog is nothing but them showing off their massive collections and offering surface-level insight into whatever they're talking about. However, much like Gregg, they must know what they're talking about because they have large collections, right? As great as On Cinema is in its early years, I think the real potential for the show is explored with the release of its first Oscar special. As the name would imply, the Oscar specials are yearly events that take place on the night of the Academy Awards. The idea is that Tim and Gregg are supposedly adding commentary to the Oscars themselves with trivia, insight, and predictions. Keeping with On Cinema's comedy, they offer no actual important or accurate information. Tim and Gregg don't even seem to really understand the concept of the award ceremony itself, thinking they are paying tribute to some guy named Oscar who is in charge of the night. The joke of the whole special is that it's apparently for Oscar buffs who really care about the night, whereas in reality, it's completely antithetical to the Oscars, since they get so off topic to the point where it might as well be on a totally random night. As someone who thinks that the Oscars are stupid, boring, self-indulgent, and a waste of time, On Cinema actually got me to look forward to Oscar night to see Tim and Gregg's shenanigans. The Oscar specials are absolute masterpieces of improvisational comedy that I would describe as being the biggest highlights of On Cinema, with the only exception being a certain murder trial. The expanding universe of On Cinema introduces many side characters who reoccur alongside Tim and Gregg. The most notable examples of this are Joe Estevez, Mark Proch, and Tim's bandmates Axiom and Manuel, all of whom play fictionalized versions of themselves. A lot of these characters have great moments and can be equally as funny as Tim and Gregg themselves, especially Mark, who, between this and Better Call Saul, is easily becoming one of my favorite comedians. And I still haven't seen the What We Do in the Shadows TV show. We also see Tim have a lot of come-and-go relationships with women throughout the series, who he brings on as guests on several occasions. This is best exemplified through the first non-Gregg guest star, Ayaka, which starts off somewhat innocently, emphasis on somewhat, before slowly building toward quite possibly the darkest storyline in all of On Cinema history. The way that some of the side characters enter and exit, while others stay around for the long haul, is really interesting, and true to the characters. There's kind of a soap opera quality to On Cinema in terms of its continuity, which is a lot of fun and encourages viewers to pay attention and keep track of what's happening. The more content I analyze for this channel, the more I realize I have an affinity for series with dramatic shifts in either tone or structure, which is why a lot of my favorite shows are things such as Moral Orel, Reboot, and The Venture Bros. While On Cinema stays a comedy throughout its entire run, although I'd argue that the ending to the Oscar specials sometimes delve into comedy horror territory, it manages to feel fresh by introducing so many bizarre elements and constantly building upon what it establishes. To give an example of that build-up and development, let's talk about the show Decker, which, as I stated previously, I was passively aware of for a while. Much like On Cinema, I figured I got the joke from the clips I had seen of Decker. It's a low-budget action parody with intentionally bad acting and special effects. While that is all true, the more context the better. Decker is a separate show from On Cinema in that Tim's character made it to make himself look like a really cool action star. The joke isn't simply that Heidecker is playing the character Decker though, it's that Tim is playing a fictionalized version of himself, playing Jack Decker. Technically speaking, you could watch Decker independently of On Cinema, and while it would still work as a low-budget spy movie parody, being aware of On Cinema and seeing how the in-universe bickering affects the outcome of Decker's plot makes the series infinitely funnier. It's kind of like a show within a show, except the show actually exists outside of the show. Very layered, and I can't say I've seen anything quite like it. It doesn't end with Decker though, as Tim also expands his repertoire through music produced by his band Dakar, and later DKR in D4. I love how everything is a play on the name Heidecker, which really highlights the narcissism of Tim's character. A running gag is that Gregg hates music and often criticizes the quality of the bands, as well as the way that they take focus away from movies. The great intentional irony of this is that Turkington started his career with a mock band called the Zip Code Rapists, which featured the members getting into fictionalized conflicts with each other. If you look into that project, you will definitely see elements which act as a precursor to the type of storytelling later found in On Cinema. By far the biggest highlight in On Cinema history, though, is the trial of Tim Heidecker. Without giving too much away, the trial was a multi-day event which featured the host of On Cinema going to trial to answer for a heinous crime. To keep it as accurate to a real proceeding as possible, the event was filmed in a real courtroom and used real-life lawyers in its proceedings. The trial is one of the most ambitious productions I've ever seen, and basically feels like a realized televised court case that happens to involve the On Cinema characters who we've been following for so long. If you weren't familiar with the On Cinema universe or the actors involved, you might actually believe it was a real trial for a little while. I'd actually really like to see someone's uninitiated reaction to this event, under the impression that it's a real case. On Cinema's comedy doesn't just extend to its videos and spin-off series though, as Tim and Gregg have brought their satire to social media as well. Tim and Gregg not only use their Twitter platforms to announce the release of new On Cinema material, but they also use them to engage in fake arguments with each other. Gregg's Twitter is solely dedicated to his On Cinema persona, while Tim switches in and out of a character on his account. As of recently, the two have taken this over to their new platform, Blue Sky. This is obviously satirizing how many internet critics, or celebrities in general, often engage in petty bickering on Twitter, which paints them in a horrible light. Again, the satire is not aged a day. I have to admit, while I do wish On Cinema garnered a larger audience than it currently has, so few people having heard about it does kind of add to the comedy in a weird way. Tim and Gregg's characters having such big egos to the point where they think Hollywood studios are copying their ideas, when in reality the show is so extremely niche, is hilarious. That being said, as niche as the On Cinema audience is, this easily has to be one of the most dedicated followings I've ever seen. The fans themselves add to the comedy of the series by taking on personas that either side with Tim or Gregg in their debates. This is where they adopted the terms Tim heads and Gregg heads, as well as neutral parties called Unity heads, who don't pick a side, but participate in the fictional debates anyway. If you look at the comments section for On Cinema videos, you'll often see these fans engaging in fake arguments with each other, not unlike the fake arguments that Tim and Gregg involve themselves in on Twitter. The On Cinema fanbase do more than add to the show's comedy though. The Oscar specials were initially hosted independently on Tim Heidecker's YouTube channel, and funded entirely through donations, rather than backing from Things X or Adult Swim. In 2020, Adult Swim dropped On Cinema from their lineup of online content as a result of budget cuts with COVID-19, putting the fate of On Cinema in serious jeopardy for the first time. Backed into a corner, Heidecker and Turkington came up with the idea of creating an independent streaming service for future seasons of On Cinema to be produced. Given that On Cinema was producing free content for the longest time, perhaps minus the Oscar specials which were funded by fans, but still free to view, making the show only available to watch behind a paid subscription was a risky move indeed. It's one that paid off though, as On Cinema continues to live on to this day, with no signs of slowing down. As of the writing of this video, On Cinema at the Cinema is in its 14th season, which is premiering every Wednesday on the High Network. What's worth noting is that the On Cinema universe is removed from the rest of Heidecker and Turkington's careers. The Awesome Show doesn't exist in this universe, and neither does Neil Hamburger, or the other projects that weren't produced for On Cinema itself, for the most part. There are a few big exceptions to this, particularly of all things the Ant-Man movies. The director of the Ant-Man trilogy, Peyton Reed, turned out to be a big fan of On Cinema, so much so that he casted Turkington in a small cameo, which was announced in the third Oscar special. In the context of the On Cinema universe, this was actually the character of Gregg getting cast in the movie itself. If you watch Ant-Man with this context in mind, it makes Turkington's cameo even better, as it's him playing the character of Gregg, playing the character of Dale in Ant-Man. Another big fan of On Cinema was Josh Trunk, the director of Fan4stick, who casted Heidecker in a brief cameo appearance. Since Ant-Man and Fan4stick came out the same year, this led to a creative rivalry between Tim and Gregg through On Cinema, with Tim bashing Ant-Man and Gregg accusing Tim of paying a hefty sum in order to get a cameo in Fan4stick. As funny as that was, it doesn't end there, as Heidecker was cast in a cameo appearance in Ant-Man vs. the Wasp, which caused Gregg to denounce the film as a ripoff created by a fake director that wasn't Peyton Reed. The third Ant-Man film changed things up again by having Gregg reprise his role as Dale, with Tim nowhere to be seen. In a later Oscar special, Josh Trunk even calls in only for Gregg to confront him about Tim's supposed paid cameo in Fan4stick. It's great to see that as niche as On Cinema is, there are mainstream movie directors who really appreciate it and want to add to the universe as much as they can. Based on reviews I've seen, it might even be safe to say that the best thing that came out of Fan4stick, or even Ant-Man Quantumania, was that they contributed to the deeper lore of the On Cinema universe. All around from top to bottom, On Cinema is quite frankly one of the best things I've ever seen. As a huge Tim and Eric and Neil Hamburger fan, it's quite a statement to say that this is the greatest thing that either of these two have ever made, but that is easily the truth. In my personal opinion, I also think this is the best web series ever, some of the best content ever produced at Adult Swim, and one of the best pieces of entertainment out there in general. If you consider the trial of Tim Heidecker collectively as a single YouTube video, then I would also probably consider that to be the single greatest YouTube video ever created, with the only other one coming close being the pipe strip analysis from Lasagna Cat. I caught up with On Cinema at the cinema while the show was in the process of airing its 13th season, also known as On Cinema On Demand. I'm really glad I did, because as much fun as it is to marathon the series over the course of a few months, it's a totally different experience watching it live and breaking. Keeping up with the posts on social media as well as news updates and other things along those lines is a huge part of the experience, and really exemplifies how immersive and unique the comedy is, even more so than simply watching the series and spin-offs from beginning to end. I'm so psyched to watch the next Oscar special live, as well as seeing where the plot of this current movie house season is going. I have speculations as to how things are going to unfold, and whether I'm right or wrong, that really tells me how invested I am in the universe at this point. As someone who makes analytical videos for the internet, On Cinema is not only really funny and relatable, but also acts as a very insightful cautionary tale for content creators. Watching Tim and Gregg shows the dangers of developing an inflated ego about yourself from achieving even a small modicum of success. It also demonstrates the danger of letting your quote-unquote knowledge about a certain subject overtake your entire personality, or thinking that because people care about your thoughts on that topic, they therefore want to hear you talk about anything and everything else, regardless as to whether or not you have anything substantial to say. With so many years of On Cinema in the pipeline, it can be really hard to follow everything, especially when it encompasses not only the main series itself, but the Oscar specials, Decker, the trial of Tim Heidecker, bonus videos, and more. I'll leave a link in the description to some playlists, which are the easiest way to keep track of everything. On Cinema is certainly a time sink, and can be a commitment to keep track of everything, but the reward you get for doing so is well worth the effort. I give On Cinema 5 bags of popcorn, and I'll throw in 50,000 high points, which Tim was probably going to deduct from my account anyway. Given how much time and effort Heidecker and Turkington have put into keeping the series going, I don't think On Cinema will be ending anytime soon. Whether it's the podcast, or the video series, or the shortly lived VR series, or the Oscar specials, or the trial, or the spin-offs, or the live shows, or the movie Mr. America, or the social media arguments, or Dakar, or Decker, or DKR, or D4, or Deck of Cards, or anything else I don't have time to rattle off about, On Cinema is peak entertainment. Thanks for watching this video. If you'd like to donate to our channel, follow the links in the video description to donate on Patreon or PayPal. You can also send us money via Super Chats on any of the videos. Also join our Discord server to talk to me and our other subscribers. If you feel so inclined, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and share for more videos. This video falls under fair use as a commentary. Until next time, here's a picture of me with Neil Hamburger. Hey, a guy's gotta flex once in a while, right?